My name is Ethan Carter, and for 8 years, I worked at Rosewood Analytics, a mid-sized consultancy tucked into the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. Every morning, before the sun had a chance to warm the sidewalks, I rode the blue line in from Logan Square, clutching a paper cup of bitter diner coffee and trying to ignore the dread curling in my stomach. To the outside world, especially to my father, who still thought a good corporate job was the pinnacle of success, I looked accomplished. My LinkedIn profile was immaculate. Project manager, top accounts, consistent quarterly bonuses, a whole string of certifications that sounded impressive but rarely meant much in practice. My colleagues liked to say I was the reliable one, the calm in the chaos. I knew how to smooth over a furious client call, massage a budget to make the numbers look better, or coach a junior analyst through a tricky dataset. But under all that, under the polished email signature, the crisp Oxford shirts, the carefully modulated voice, I was crumbling. I suppose it started the day I realized I no longer cared if my work succeeded or failed. The thought frightened me more than I admitted at the time. Rosewood Analytics was the sort of place that thrived on superficial camaraderie. There were birthday bagels and awkward happy hours at the bar downstairs. Slack channels filled with gifs and forced here. But everyone knew which side of the building you sat on determined how long you'd last. The North Wing, where I sat, housed the rainmakers, the senior managers with their glossy smiles and expense accounts. I was stuck between them and the newer hires who didn't yet understand that nothing about the place was as friendly as it looked. My direct supervisor, Calvin Briggs, was a tall man with cold blue eyes and the sort of handshake that felt like a dare. Calvin liked to remind everyone that Rosewood was a family, but he also liked to remind me, sometimes in the same sentence, that my position was never guaranteed. "You know, Ethan," he said one Monday morning, as I handed him the updated projections he demanded at midnight the night before, "you'd be a lot happier if you just learned to stop caring so much. Nobody here appreciates martyrs." I stood there, my hands slightly trembling. I'd worked 70 hours that week. I hadn't seen my girlfriend Emily in days. My mother's calls had gone unanswered, but I forced a smile. I'll keep that in mind. When I returned to my cubicle, I stared at the family photo I kept pinned to my divider. Emily leaning against me at Navy Pier, our smiles bright and real in the summer sunlight. A different version of myself had stood there, a man who believed he was building something worthwhile. The phone on my desk buzzed, breaking me out of the memory. "Carter," Calvin's voice came through, already annoyed. "We're going to need you on the Kaplan proposal today. Forget the regional portfolio review. That's not a priority. That review is due by 5, I reminded him carefully. "Then work faster," he said and hung up. I felt something inside me snap, a thin fiber of restraint that had held me steady through all the disappointments and petty humiliations. That evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, I lingered in the office long after everyone else left. The quiet was almost peaceful. I opened the Kaplan proposal on my screen and tried to concentrate, but my thoughts kept drifting. I thought about Emily's tired eyes when I came home past midnight, about my father's voice on the voicemail. "We're proud of you, son, but you sound tired. Is everything okay?" I thought about the morning I'd accepted this job, convinced it would be the stepping stone to something better. My chest tightened. I shut the laptop and leaned back in my chair. That's when the email came. The sender was an unfamiliar address, just a string of letters and numbers, but the subject line was clear. "I know what they did. Do you?" My heart stuttered. I clicked it open, expecting spam or a phishing attempt. Instead, there was a single line of text. "Check the ledger for Q3. Ask Calvin about the incentives." That was it. No attachments, no signature. I stared at the message, adrenaline creeping into my limbs. The Q3 ledger? My mind scrambled back through old records. There had been inconsistencies, small discrepancies I'd flagged, only to be told they were rounding errors. I read the email again, feeling something shift in my gut. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe it was a trap. But I knew, as surely as I'd ever known anything, that nothing in my life was going to be the same again. The next morning, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. I arrived at 6:45 a.m., as usual, and settled into my cubicle. But every time I opened the Kaplan proposal, my eyes blurred. I found myself scanning the internal database instead, searching the old Q3 reports. The inconsistencies were still there, buried under layers of innocuous transactions. But this time I noticed something else, a pattern of bonuses and adjustments that made no sense. Names appeared on payout lists that shouldn't have qualified. Calvin's name was there, along with two other executives. My pulse thudded against my throat. I felt watched, though no one was near my desk. When Calvin breezed in an hour later, he stopped to look at me with that thin-lipped smile. Busy morning? I forced my own smile, my mind racing. Always. He didn't notice my hands were shaking. By lunchtime, I couldn't focus on anything else. I printed the ledger pages and stuffed them into a plain folder. Then I walked down to the coffee shop across the street and sat in the corner, staring at the evidence. If this was true, it wasn't just a matter of ethics. It was a matter of fraud. A sudden, unexpected thought crossed my mind. Maybe this is my chance to finally walk away. I closed the folder and set it on the table, feeling the weight of possibilities settle over me. In that moment, I didn't yet know how far I'd go, or how spectacularly everything would implode. I only knew the life I'd built was already splintering. I woke up the next morning feeling an unusual calm, like the moment before a storm hits. As I brushed my teeth, I caught my reflection and noticed something unsettling. My eyes looked empty, as if some essential part of me had evaporated overnight. I ignored the dread clenching my gut and went about my routine, packing my laptop into my battered leather bag. When I pulled into the company parking lot, I almost turned around. The building itself seemed darker, more oppressive. Maybe it was the cloudy sky casting shadows across the tinted windows, but it felt as though the place had transformed into a giant mausoleum overnight. I swiped my badge at the entrance, half hoping it wouldn't work, so I could take that as a sign to run. But the door clicked open, obedient as ever, and I stepped inside. The receptionist, Maria, greeted me without her usual brightness. Her voice sounded forced. "Morning, Adam," she mumbled, her eyes darting away. "Morning," I replied, trying not to sound as hollow as I felt. My cubicle was exactly as I'd left it. Stacks of project folders, a dented thermos, and a photo of me with my brother, Sean, at Yellowstone. That picture always reminded me there was a world beyond fluorescent lights and quarterly earnings. I logged into my workstation and checked my email. My heart dropped when I saw a new thread with the subject line, "Urgent Restructuring Proposal." I opened it and read. As my eyes scanned the corporate jargon, one sentence stood out in sharp relief. "Effective immediately, certain positions will be dissolved as part of our cost reduction strategy." My hands went cold. I looked up just as Natalie, my colleague and the only real friend I had in this place, rushed over. Her face was flushed, her lips trembling. "Adam, have you seen this?" she whispered, her voice tight with panic. I nodded slowly. "They're going to gut the entire department," I said, my voice dull. She sank into the spare chair beside my desk and buried her face in her hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We'd always joked about quitting in a blaze of glory, but we hadn't imagined it would come to this. When she looked up, her blue eyes were sharp with desperation. "We need to find out what's really going on," she hissed. "This doesn't feel right." I swallowed, the dread blooming into a sick fascination. "You mean more than just layoffs?" Natalie glanced around as if someone might be listening. "I heard Hank from finance say the company's been cooking the books," she whispered. "If that's true, this is about covering it up, getting rid of anyone who might ask questions." I tried to process it. The idea that the place I'd given 7 years of my life to was built on fraud made me feel like the floor had cracked beneath me. "Who else knows?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm not waiting around to find out. If they think I'm going to roll over and let them ruin my life." She stopped, her eyes widening. Over her shoulder, I saw Richard, our department head, striding toward us with the controlled rage of a man who knows he's losing control. "Adam, Natalie, my office." Now, he barked. We followed him, our feet heavy. Richard's office smelled like stale coffee and fear. He gestured for us to sit but didn't bother taking his own seat. Instead, he stood by the blinds, staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot as if it held the answers to all his problems. "You've both been here long enough to understand how this works," he began, his voice low. "There are decisions being made above my head. I'm trying to protect the team as best I can." "With all due respect," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "what exactly are you protecting us from?" He turned to face me, his expression a mask. "Speculation isn't going to help anyone. You need to focus on your deliverables and let me worry about the rest." Natalie let out a short, humorless laugh. "You expect us to sit here while you dismantle our jobs?" Richard's jaw twitched. "Do not make this harder than it has to be," he snapped. "You still have time to prove your value." A flicker of disgust curled my lip. "I've given this company everything," I said, voice rising. "Late nights, weekends, sacrifices. And you're telling me that loyalty means nothing?" His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then went flat again. "Loyalty is a luxury we can't afford." The words settled between us like poison. Natalie stood. "I'm not staying," she said quietly. "I'll pack my things." Richard didn't try to stop her. She walked out, her shoulders squared. I lingered another moment, searching his face for any sign of regret, any trace of the man who'd once mentored me. But all I saw was a frightened bureaucrat clinging to a crumbling empire. I turned and left without another word. Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and began gathering every file I could find. If there was evidence of fraud, I'd be damned if I let them bury it. My pulse raced as I copied documents onto a flash drive, each click of the mouse a small act of defiance. Natalie appeared at the entrance to my cubicle, her coat draped over one arm. "Are you coming?" she asked, voice low. "Not yet," I said. "I need to finish this." She nodded once, understanding passing between us. "I'll be in touch," she whispered, then disappeared into the hallway. I worked in a trance, barely noticing as the office around me emptied. When I finally leaned back in my chair, the sky outside had turned a bruised shade of purple. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, adrenaline surging. I didn't know exactly what I'd found, only that it felt dangerous. As I walked out of that building, I had no idea that within weeks, the entire company would collapse under the weight of its own secrets. But that night, as rain hammered my windshield, I knew something irrevocable had begun. I sat alone on the edge of my bed that night, my laptop screen glowing an icy blue as it illuminated the worried lines on my face. My name is Brandon Miller, and ever since I stormed out of Fairfax and Boyd Consulting with the weight of 6 years of resentment burning a hole in my chest, I hadn't been able to sleep. The initial rush of freedom had dissolved into a raw, unsettled fear. I'd made the decision, some would say a reckless, impulsive decision, to go out in a blaze of brutal honesty, but I hadn't really thought about what would happen next. The more I replayed the moment in my mind, me standing on that conference table, reading aloud a list of unethical dealings I'd uncovered in the company's internal audits, the more I realized there was no way to unring that bell. My voice had shaken at first, but once I saw my boss's face, Douglas Connors, with his plastic smile and cold gray eyes, I felt something unlock inside me. I'd kept my head down for too long. I'd let them walk all over me. And when I finally let it all out, I knew I'd crossed a line there was no coming back from. I scrolled through my email again, half hoping to see a message from someone, maybe my old coworker Sarah Morales, who had given me a look of wide-eyed respect when I'd called out Doug's embezzlement schemes. But there was nothing. Just spam and a single note from my landlord reminding me that rent was due. At 2 a.m, I closed the laptop and stared into the darkness. I needed a plan. I'd quit without another job lined up. Stupid, I knew, but part of me didn't care. If the company was as corrupt as I suspected, they deserved to be exposed. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terrified. My savings would last maybe 3 months, tops. I had rent, insurance, student loans. Every practical part of me screamed that I should have stayed quiet and waited until I had something secure. But the part of me that finally felt alive refused to be sorry. The next morning, I dragged myself to Carla's Cafe, a little corner coffee shop I'd practically lived in during my first year at Fairfax and Boyd, back when the job still felt like a promise instead of a prison. Carla herself poured me a mug of black coffee. She had this kind of quiet sympathy that made me feel like I didn't have to pretend. "You look like you've been fighting with ghosts," she said gently. "Something like that," I muttered, staring into the coffee. I pulled out my phone and started making a list in my notes app. If I was going to turn this mess into something purposeful, I needed to figure out my next steps. 1. Find new employment, something with integrity. I knew it wouldn't be easy. My last act had made me radioactive in the consulting world. 2. Gather evidence. If Doug and his cronies tried to deny what I'd exposed, I needed proof. 3. Reach out to Sarah. She knew more than she let on. Maybe she'd help me. 4. Talk to a lawyer. I'd read enough about whistleblower protections to know I might be able to shield myself from retaliation. I kept rewriting the list over and over, as if the repetition would steady my nerves. But every time I got to the end, the question that haunted me was, what if they came after me? Around noon, my phone buzzed. A private number. My chest tightened. I stepped outside into the alley behind the cafe and answered. "Brandon Miller?" A clipped voice said. "Yes. This is Detective Karen Lawson with the Financial Crimes Division. We received an anonymous tip about irregularities at Fairfax and Boyd Consulting. We'd like to talk to you." I pressed my back against the brick wall. My pulse hammered. Did you say anonymous tip? That's correct. We were told you might have documents relevant to an investigation. I closed my eyes. A week ago, I'd have panicked. But in that moment, something crystallized. If the authorities were looking into Fairfax and Boyd, I wasn't alone. And maybe if I played this right, my reckless exit could be the catalyst for exposing everything. "All right," I said, my voice low. "I'm willing to cooperate." After I hung up, I sank down onto a crate, the phone clutched in my hand. That phone call changed everything. The stakes had gone from personal humiliation to something much larger: federal crimes, possible indictments. If Doug realized I was cooperating, he'd do whatever it took to silence me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table under the yellow glow of a single bulb, sorting through the backup files I'd made. All those late nights auditing their ledgers had given me leverage. The question was whether I was brave enough to use it. I called Sarah. She picked up after 2 rings. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said softly. "You knew, didn't you? About the shell companies." "I knew some of it," she admitted, "but not everything. After you left, I started looking deeper." I hesitated. "Are you in?" "I'm in," she said without hesitation. "But you realize this is dangerous." "I know," I whispered. We talked for nearly an hour, strategizing. We'd gather everything we could. We'd meet Detective Lawson in person. And when the time came, we'd testify if we had to. When I finally hung up, I felt a cold, exhilarating clarity. I was no longer just a disgruntled employee. I was someone who had the power to bring down an empire built on lies. But the deeper I went into this plan, the more I understood how much I stood to lose. My safety, my reputation, my chance at a future in my field. Every choice I made from that point forward was a step deeper into something I couldn't undo. The following week was a blur of movement. I spent my days in Sarah's apartment, cross-referencing invoices, emails, and bank records. At night, I barely slept. I kept the blinds drawn and my phone on silent. Once, I thought I saw a black SUV idling outside my building, and my skin prickled with dread. Sarah tried to reassure me. "They can't do anything if we stay visible," she insisted. "We're working with law enforcement." But I knew how much money Fairfax and Boyd had at their disposal. Enough to buy silence. Enough to make people disappear. One evening, Sarah printed out a summary of the evidence so far. I stared at the stack of paper, my hands trembling. It was all here, proof that Doug had funneled millions into offshore accounts, falsified expense reports, bribed officials. The company's shiny reputation was built on rot. I thought of the day I'd first walked into that office, bright-eyed and eager, believing I was about to start a career that mattered. That kid would never have imagined it would end with me risking everything to take them down. And yet, here I was, more alive and more afraid than I'd ever been. That night, I drafted an encrypted email to Detective Lawson. "We have the documents. We're ready to meet." As I pressed send, I knew I had just crossed another line. There was no turning back. And no guarantee that any of us would come out of this unscathed. I didn't sleep the night before my final showdown with Titan Tech. It felt as though every nerve in my body was electrified, each heartbeat a dull thud echoing in my ears. The dawn came pale and cold, and by the time I stepped into the glass lobby, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I'd rehearsed what I would say, how I would say it, but nothing could have prepared me for the way it actually felt, stepping back into the building I had once called my second home. The same security guard, Brian, gave me a stiff nod as I signed in. He didn't smile. No one did. When the elevator door slid shut, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored walls. My jaw was clenched so tight it ached. My eyes were bright, almost feverish. It was a look I barely recognized. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe the old me couldn't have done what I was about to do. The elevator chimed. I walked the long hall to the executive conference room where the quarterly meeting was about to start. It had taken weeks to arrange this. I'd called in every favor I could, used every shred of leverage I'd accumulated. Some of it had been petty, some of it brilliant. All of it was risky. Inside the conference room, the board of directors sat in high-backed chairs, their faces lit by the glow of a massive screen. Numbers and charts scrolled in real time, revenue plummeting, operating costs exploding, investors in open revolt. I knew I had precisely 15 minutes before the meeting moved to a closed session. 15 minutes to deliver the final blow. When I walked in, all conversation stopped. "Ethan Miller," barked Greg Talbot, the CEO, his voice flat and incredulous. "You're not authorized to be here." I took a deep breath. "I have documentation you'll want to see," I said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Copies have already been sent to your general counsel, but I thought you'd appreciate the courtesy of seeing it in person." Greg looked at me like I'd sprouted horns. He didn't even touch the folder. "This is harassment. Security will escort you." But a woman I didn't recognize, a petite brunette in a navy suit, interrupted him. "Greg, hold on." She picked up the folder and flipped through the first few pages. Her brow furrowed. "These look like internal audits." I nodded. "They are. And they show that you misrepresented earnings by at least 18% over the past 2 quarters. That, coupled with the whistleblower complaints about discriminatory hiring practices and the data privacy breaches, well, it's not a great look." Silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Greg's face went white, then mottled red. "This is nonsense. You're just a disgruntled ex-employee." "Maybe," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "But it doesn't really matter what you call me, because the SEC already has the same documents. And so does every major media outlet in New York." My phone buzzed. Right on cue. I looked down and saw the email confirmation. The press releases were live. "This is extortion," Greg sputtered. His voice was hoarse, ragged with panic. "You'll be sued into oblivion." I tilted my head. "Perhaps. But I doubt your shareholders will appreciate you spending their money trying to silence someone whose claims are fully documented." Someone at the table, a man in a gray blazer, rose slowly to his feet. "Greg, is this true?" Greg didn't answer. He just stared at me with a hatred so pure it almost seemed to burn the air between us. It was in that moment that I realized he was finished. He knew it too. The woman in the navy suit cleared her throat. "Mr. Miller, do you have any further statements?" I shook my head. My voice felt surprisingly calm. "Just this. I spent years here believing that hard work and loyalty mattered. That if I kept my head down and did everything right, I'd be respected. Turns out, you can only play that game for so long before you realize it's rigged." I turned to leave, but Greg slammed his palm on the table. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think this makes you better than us?" I stopped in the doorway and looked back. "No," I said quietly. "I think it makes me free." I stepped out into the hall as the shouting erupted behind me. A tide of voices, accusations, denials, the beginning of the end. My heart was hammering, but I felt lighter than I had in years. As I walked toward the elevator, I passed coworkers whose faces were pale and stunned. Some wouldn't meet my eyes. Some did, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been respect, or maybe just awe. Down in the lobby, the news was already breaking on the giant television above the reception desk. A chart scrolled across the screen. Titan Tech executives under investigation for fraud. I stood there for a moment, just watching. Then I pulled open the glass doors and stepped into the early afternoon light. The sky was bright, a fierce blue that seemed almost unreal after the dim corridors upstairs. I took a deep breath, tasting the freedom of it. Behind me, the building that had once felt inescapable was already beginning to crumble, metaphorically and, I suspected soon, financially. I didn't know what would come next. Lawsuits, maybe. 1,000 complications I couldn't predict. But I knew I wouldn't regret this moment. For the first time in years, I had chosen my own story. And that, I thought, was worth everything. I don't think I ever could have prepared myself for the emptiness that followed the collapse of Viridian Consulting. I remember sitting in the kitchen of my small Denver apartment, a mug of stale coffee cooling in my hands, and staring at the TV as the news anchor rattled off the details of the firm's bankruptcy. It felt surreal to see it all unfold, like a chapter that had started with me and ended with a spectacular implosion I never intended to cause. A part of me felt vindicated. Another part of me felt hollow, as if every bit of outrage and adrenaline I'd been living on had finally burned itself out. I knew I wasn't the only one affected. Hundreds of employees had woken up to find that their paychecks were gone, their benefits stripped away, their careers in limbo. Even if I believed my departure had merely triggered something that was always coming, it didn't erase the guilt coiling in my chest. After that day, I stopped checking LinkedIn. I didn't want to see the posts, some cursing management, some begging for leads, some pretending this was a blessing in disguise. I unplugged my laptop, turned off the notifications on my phone, and let myself sit in silence. It was there, in that hush, that I started to realize how much of my identity had been wrapped up in that company. For so long, I'd measured my worth by my performance reviews, my hours billed, my ability to please people who didn't respect me. Now, there was no one left to impress. No one left to disappoint. Just me, and the person I'd nearly lost while trying to survive in a place that had never cared about me. A week after the collapse, I met Nicole at a coffee shop near Capitol Hill. She looked exhausted, her hair up in a careless bun, dark circles under her eyes. She'd spent the last week scrambling to salvage her own projects, contacting clients to explain what had happened. We hugged longer than we probably should have, both of us relieved just to see a familiar face who understood the chaos. "I can't believe it's really over," she said quietly, stirring her latte. "I know," I murmured. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel nothing but relief, but there's just so much wreckage." Nicole nodded. "It was always going to fall apart eventually. You just had the courage to walk away before it buried you." Her words stayed with me as I started piecing my life back together. I reconnected with my brother, who had been gently trying to remind me for years that I deserved better. I started therapy, finally confronting the way I'd learned to equate constant stress with value. I began journaling every morning, untangling the beliefs that had kept me stuck for so long. There were days when the regret was heavy, like a lead blanket. I would think of the colleagues I'd left behind, some of whom I genuinely respected, and wonder if I'd failed them somehow. Other days, I felt a strange peace, as if all the shouting and the slammed doors and the humiliations were finally receding into memory. One afternoon, I took a walk downtown and passed the old Viridian office. The building was empty, the glass facade reflecting the sky like nothing had ever happened inside. A "for lease" sign hung crookedly in the window. I stood across the street for a long time, watching as strangers hurried past, oblivious to the ghosts lingering behind the locked doors. I thought of Richard Coleman, the CEO who'd berated me in that final meeting, and wondered where he was now. I doubted he'd lost everything. People like him always seemed to land on their feet. But I no longer felt any urge to find out. His opinion no longer held power over me. In the months that followed, I built something new from the fragments of my old life. I started a consulting business of my own, this time on my own terms. I refused to take clients who treated people like disposable cogs. I hired 2 former colleagues, people I trusted, to help me, and we worked in a small co-working space with big windows that flooded the room with light. For the first time, I felt like I was creating something that mattered. Not just profit, but purpose. Not just a job, but a life. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the skyline, I sat at my desk, the warm glow casting long shadows across the polished wood. I thought about the person I'd been on that last day at Viridian, the person who had finally stood up and said, "Enough." That version of me had been scared and angry and desperate. But they'd also been brave. I realized then that even though the fallout had been messy and painful, I wouldn't have changed a thing. My worst day had become the doorway to something better. When I locked up the office that night, I took one last look at the space we'd made together. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was ours. And it was enough. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope.